Hello and welcome to the Argyle SMB Finance Leadership Forum. My name is Brittany Sullivan with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. I have some important information to share with you, and then we will turn the floor over to our esteemed opening keynote speaker. First, we would like to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Vertex. Our partner is committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. At any time during today's event, you can visit their virtual booths from the main agenda page, which includes complimentary materials, information, and meet and greet opportunities. We also welcome you to stay socially connected during today's event. For those of you who are active tweeters, please use the hashtag ArgyleDigital and follow us on Twitter at ArgyleExecForum. Also be sure to follow Argyle on LinkedIn for special announcements. I would also like to take a moment to touch on our content neutrality policy, which we have curated based on the feedback we've received over the years from our members. We have worked closely with our speaking faculty to ensure that you receive a set of balanced and neutral viewpoints during this session today, and we truly appreciate our members' support of this policy. Finally, and most importantly, we would love to hear from you. So during each session, we encourage you to submit your questions and comments in the Q&A box on your screen. Following each presentation, we have set aside time for our speakers to weigh in on your questions. Thank you again for joining us. Now let's get started. Without further delay, I would like to introduce Christopher Hollinger, Chief Financial Officer at Rethink Food NYC. We're excited to have Chris with us for his opening keynote titled SMBs and Supply Chains, Tackling Disruption to Sustain Revenue Streams. Welcome, Chris, and over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you, everyone, for joining. So today I want to talk about, like you said, SMBs and supply chains. I want to cover a couple of points. One, I want to talk about where we are and how we've got to the situation that we are. And then I want to talk about actions to sustain revenue streams and profits, followed by a Q&A session, but feel free to drop questions throughout the session. I'll be monitoring those, and if any of the questions relate to something I'm talking about, I'm going to answer it real time also. So let's get started. So globalization and technology have been two of the major catalysts over the last couple of years that have really driven a lot of the world, as well as what has happened with small and medium-sized businesses. Of course, with globalization, it has allowed global supply chains. Small and medium-sized businesses can now source materials, source product from any place in the world. This has, of course, in addition to technology has significantly decreased the cost of doing business. It also has allowed small and medium-sized businesses to be able to manage inventory much better, such that you can have more real-time inventory management. This, of course, has led to decreased costs and increased sales. Increased sales, of course, have related to, and the decreased costs have also been very profitable for a lot of small and medium-sized businesses. And these are things that have been really good. Then, of course, we came into COVID and things have started to change. One of the things I think is very interesting is just looking at inventories over time. If you look at, for retailers as well as total businesses, how inventories were starting to go down basically because of more real-time, just-in-time inventory management systems. And then in 2010, during the financial crisis, inventories increased because of, primarily because of the financial crisis and the resulting recession. Then it just kind of steady went along for the next couple of years until you see the very big spike during COVID. And we remember all what happened during then. People were shut in. The world kind of came to a close, and a lot of companies really accumulated significant amount of inventories. Then, of course, they've started to work down those inventories. We've come into a situation where a lot of manufacturers, particularly in overseas, China in particular, because of COVID restrictions, really impacted the ability of companies to restock their inventories. And then the whole globalization kind of started going to reverse. It became more of an issue as opposed to a benefit to a lot of companies. So where have all these supply chain disruptions really impacted? What industries? Where are the disruptions? Manufacturing was hit very hard. Like I was saying earlier, a lot of companies started to source product from China and other seas markets, particularly for a much lower cost than what you get it from domestic suppliers. This, of course, was very beneficial to companies at the time, but now with supply chain disruptions, like I said, closures during COVID, increased shipping delays because of things coming overseas, there have been significant disruptions to various industries, manufacturing being the top one. Construction was also hit very hard. One of the companies that I'm an investor in, they actually they're building a new facility in Cleveland, and they were hit very hard by disruptions in the supply chain. And so what was anticipated to be a new facility opening up last year is still in the process of trying to continue to complete the construction because of materials that have been lacking. You can also say that retail trade, of course, was hit very hard from this supply chain disruptions, wholesale trade, accommodation, and other industries. So it's been broad-based as far as where are the delays and where are the disruptions. Supply chain disruptions add significantly to costs for companies that are doing business. I'm sure everyone heard about and familiar with the blockage in the Suez Canal. Whereas, as you can see, what would normally take 25.5 days to transmit goods and services, it went up to 34 days because the Suez Canal was blocked, and so they had to go around the Cape of Good Hope. This is just one big example of kind of supply chain disruptions, but I'm sure every company has stories they can tell of how their supply chain was disrupted or impacted by different things. Supply chain disruptions not only add to the time that you will receive your goods or services, but it also clearly can add costs. Going around the Cape of Good Hope, adding additional days from a shipping standpoint, of course, will add additional costs. And those costs are something that will, impact you because, generally the suppliers will have to pass those costs along to you as their customer. So this could be a very, very disruptive from your business as well as for your profit margins, of course. So what kind of actions can you take? And this is where I want to really spend a lot of more time talking about, what can you really do to try to address these supply chain disruptions and how it's really impacting your business? First thing you can try to do is diversify your supply chain. One of the things that's becoming really, really important and really prevalent in a lot of industries is that a lot of companies are starting to reshore. Whereas they would look to globalization, international supply chain, a lot of companies are looking to bring their suppliers closer to home so that the shipping time is much less than having to ship the goods or receive the goods from overseas. So it's definitely a big thing. One of the other things a lot of companies are looking at doing is really focused on looking at different suppliers. And this can take many forms. One, you can add additional suppliers because if one of your suppliers is having issues getting their goods and services from wherever they source, you can look for an alternative supplier who can potentially get your products and services to you much quicker. You can also look at, adding secondary suppliers. You can also look at clearly, if there is potential to complement or to get substitute goods or services and bring that into your product mix that you offer to your customers. And then just new inventory management practices. One of the things, clearly you can do, you can start to stock inventory, and that's what a lot of companies have done, particularly if you have warehouse space where you can bring those goods and services and just pre-order as much as possible. Several, chip manufacturers, particularly the technology industry, really, did this to try to make sure they had, supplies in hand so that they can continue their business. But of course, that can add to costs. The other thing that I think is really important is to really look at your pricing. And as you can see here, for all of us who went to business school or from our business school or business or economics education, very familiar with this curve. When your price goes down generally or goes up, generally the quantity that's demanded comes down. So you want to be able to carry, carry those costs that you're getting from your suppliers, particularly from the supply chain disruptions. You want to, pass those along to your customers, but you have to be cognizant of the fact that there's only so much or price raise you can pass along before the demand for your product, your goods or services start to go down. So something always to be mindful of. And it all comes back to how elastic the demand is for your product or service. If you have a product or service that people really demand and they really want, you can probably have a lot more pricing power. Whereas, if you have a more commoditized type of product or service, you only have so much pricing that you can really do, and that may really impact you. Now I want to go into expense rationalization. And this is where we as finance professionals really can earn our keep and really add a lot of value to the business. Whenever you have costs going up, you really want to be focused on how can you rationalize your expense base. So one of the things we do, at least on a quarterly basis, we do a really deep dive into all of our suppliers, everything that we're spending money on. In concert with that, we have a pretty bad inflation situation going on, although it is somewhat moderating from what it was last year, and everything seems to be more expensive. And when things are more expensive, clearly you have to be, as a finance professional, much more cognizant of ways of being very rational about your expenses and really adding a lot of value to the senior management team to really help them to understand where can costs be taken out of the organization. We have one question: has business ever considered too small to be able to implement some of these actions? I think one of the things that's really great is that depending on your goods or services that your business is doing, a lot of companies, even very small companies, have benefited, like I said, historically from globalization, being able to buy supplies or goods or services to resell much cheaper than what you may have been able to do in the past, sourcing from domestic sources. So all companies, I think, can definitely use all of these actions, being, regardless of the size, particularly, from the standpoint of thinking about the pricing. You may want to add new goods or services, particularly, differentiating your suppliers, looking at different ways of cutting your costs, something that, regardless of the size of your business, you can definitely be able to implement. And then the last thing I really want to talk about is cash traps. Where is your cash trap? And this is something that I think, once again, also we as finance professionals can really add a lot of value to the business. I spoke earlier that one of the things you may want to do, particularly if you have supply chain disruptions from your suppliers, is stockpiling more inventory. Well, of course, stockpiling more inventory requires cash, and so you have cash tied up in inventory, and you may or may not be able to sell that or move that inventory. So it's a double-edged sword. Yes, it can help you to have enough inventory on hand for sales, but then also it traps a lot of cash. So as a finance professional, you have to be really cognizant of just how much cash is tied up in inventory and or other places, because cash, clearly, particularly in an inflationary environment, is something that you really want to have a lot of ability and a lot of cash on hand to be able to do things. So it's definitely really important, and something you want to be cognizant of and aware of. Just want to talk a little bit, more so about kind of what we as finance professionals can do to really play a really important and key role. The first one, diversifying the supply chain. Finance professionals, clearly, we're somewhat limited in our ability to really affect this component, because clearly most companies will have people who are responsible for managing the inventory, and that may or may not be a part of the finance team. The smaller the size of the company, generally, we as finance professionals have to wear a lot of hats. So you will probably be playing some role in helping to determine suppliers, evaluating suppliers. In addition to running finance here at Rethink Food, I also manage our technology team. And so one of the things we're really focused on technology solutions to really help us to manage our inventory much better. And just to give you an idea of kind of what we do, we're a nonprofit focused on food insecurity, but we also have a commissary kitchen. And while we use a lot of excess food that we pick up from through our trucking fleet for our commissary kitchen, we also have to buy a lot of food that we source from outside suppliers. So we really want to be very cognizant. And what happens is we weigh all of our inventories that comes in, the donated food, and then we supplement by buying additional food so we can make meals, and then those meals are distributed. So we have a dashboard that we use to keep track of how much donated food comes in, so that we can minimize the amount of food that we have to purchase. That, of course, helps us to cut down the amount of cash that we have to outlay, and help us to really be much more mindful of managing our inventory and look at, from that standpoint, not being really impacted by anything that's may disrupt our supply chain or may impact our suppliers who are supplying food to us. Like I was saying earlier, pricing was one of the areas that we as finance team could really play a major part in, because one of the things finance is generally called upon is to help the senior management to determine how you go about pricing your product or service. From my experience, you really don't want to continuously be raising prices. So you really want to, as much as possible, be forward-looking and to really forecast very well what your costs are going to be in advance. So for us, we do a annual budget. I'm sure most of your companies do an annual budget, but we also do budget to actuals, and then we reforecast every month using the actuals, and then budget, making adjustments based off of kind of what we see. So generally, when you see increased costs from supply chain disruptions or even inflation, you really need to be cognizant of how you're going to price your product, because you really want to try and maintain your profit margin as much as possible. And like I said, you really don't want to just continuously be raising prices, because that may impact your ability to really sell more of your product or service. So you really want to be as much as forward-looking as possible and do one or two price increases that will capture what you anticipate to be supply chain disruptions, increased cost because of supply chain disruptions or inflation. Clearly, this is much easier said than done. And sometimes, depending on what kind of company you have, you may not be able to capture enough, and clearly you may get a hit to your margin. But that's something that, once again, you have to think about your expense rationalization, because if you aren't able to pass along the cost or the price increases that you do put in place, do not capture all of the additional expenses, then you really have to think about and be much more cognizant of where can you cut costs to be able to try to maintain margin. And then back to cash traps. One of the things I remember, I was at a conference this past summer, and it was a really good time to talk on, in inflation, cash is king. And so cash is king for many small businesses, because a lot of businesses, confuse revenues with cash. Depending on, your customers, your payment terms from where you get paid for your product or service may be anywhere from instantaneous, if you're a retail environment, to 30, 60, 90 days. Well, if you're paying your suppliers, and as well as your people weekly or on a much faster basis, and you're bringing your cash in or being paid by your customers in 30, 60 days, it's something that could be really, really detrimental. So you always have to be cognizant of cash and being mindful of that cash. Cash is king. I have another question here. Any recommendations for organizations struggling to develop contingency plans? I think that, you know, my recommendation is that you have to be very cognizant of and think about what are all the areas that things could go wrong. And clearly, you may not capture them all. But I think if you start to put down scenario 1, scenario 2, scenario 3, these are the worst case scenarios. This is what can happen. And then your contingency plan, they make a contingency plan around each one of those. There may be some things that you don't see clearly. For example, you have a pandemic and a lot of businesses are forced to shut down. But hopefully in one of those scenarios that you have, there are things that you have in place that you can build on such that you can address any contingencies. Another question, what do you think this year will hold in regard to economic disruption or the impending recession, and how can organizations stay ahead of this? I think that there is going to be, I think we are probably going to have a short, shallow recession. A lot of the economists clearly are saying that, based off kind of what's happening, that we are or will soon be in a recession. But I think that, a lot of great companies were built during recessions, because whenever recessions happen, there are certain things that, are beneficial to companies. One, it forces you to be more cognizant of your cost basis, and it helps you to be more mindful and to run lean. And then also at some point, costs do come down in a recession. And so it helps you to re-rationalize your cost base, and in a lot of cases, make yourself much stronger for going forward. So I think that's, kind of things to keep in mind. But also, once again, I think you always have to be conscious of, what is your cash? And if you are going to recession, and particularly if you are a business where a lot of your revenues are tied around consumers, clearly in recessions, consumers will cut back, and that's going to have an impact on your revenues. In that case, now and in advance for that, you really need to start thinking about how can I stockpile cash such that when my revenues potentially do decrease, I'll have enough cash on hand, or bank lines of credit, or other ways to really continue to pay your people, pay your fixed costs, and just in general be able to continue to operate. Because whenever your revenues are down, clearly the cash that's coming in, your cash that you're bringing in will go down, and then you really want to be able to still have cash on hand to operate.
Thank you so much, Chris, for such an excellent keynote. I also want to thank everyone who joined us today. This session, along with all of today's content, will be made available on demand following the event.